So you say, why do I love Luzerne? Well, look at all these memories. I mean, it's just great. I wish my kids would sit down and listen to, the stories about what was. Because you can't these young people dispose of the past too readily. They ought to take from it some of the joys of it and kind of mix it into their own style of living instead of cutting it off and saying, oh, that used to be so.
They'll come around when they get older.
Well, I won't be here, so you let me know.
Fourth Lake Annals. Each person has his or own image of the community at the Fourth Lake of Lake Luzerne. In 1976, Martin Rosoff, a librarian at Midwood High School in Brooklyn and a denizen of Fourth Lake community, wrote Annals. He begins, and this is Martin's quote: 2 miles north of the village of Lake Luzerne is the community of Fourth Lake. The community consists for the most part of summer residents who return year after year for relaxation and recreation. An 1887 guidebook describes Luzerne in these words: Lake of Luzerne, 700 feet above sea level, surrounded by hills, is a picture of beauty in itself. The dry and invigorating atmosphere is a tonic. The soil sandy and absorbent, the water soft and pure from granite rock. The breezes blow over living timber over pine, spruce, and the gummy and resinous trees which statistics show are conducive to long life. The place is recommended by the best physicians as good for rheumatism, good for throat and lung difficulties, good for dyspeptics, good for general debility, good for all who desire rest and quiet. End quote. Summer visitors have been attracted to Fourth Lake since the early 1900s. Some of the present cottages began as hunting lodges, consisting of a single room and a pantry. In time, as water and electricity were brought in, additions and modernization converted the cabins into respectable domiciles. Fourth Lakers are convinced that their community has a character and history that set it apart from other so-called bungalow colonies. Each of the houses is individually owned. Because ownership over the years has remained relatively stable, it has been possible to realize certain objectives contributing to the enjoyment of all. One of the unique characteristics of the community is the widespread desire to teach somebody something. Individuals volunteer to lead activities without any thought of reward other than personal satisfaction. 30 years ago, people attended bridge lessons and classes in French. Coaching sessions were conducted for those planning to take the examination for license in the New York City school principal. A 1959 notice on the bulletin board brought 17 adults, each with an instrument, for weekly music lessons on the recorder. The number and variety of recreational diversions reached the peak in the summer of 1973. There were the usual evening activities: duplicate bridge, folk dancing, and community squares. Daytime classes in sewing, indoor gardening, and modern dance were given. Elementary and intermediate bridge sessions were held, and square dance workshops on all levels were conducted. A beginner's folk dance class was organized. In addition, a number of special events were scheduled: an evening boat ride on Lake George, a lecture on parapsychology, a social dance with live music provided by one of the residents, a lecture on the heavenly bodies by our own local astronomer, 2 musical happenings, a garage sale, a reading of the play Visit to a Small Planet, and a movie program including 1 XXX rated porno film. At one time, the community had a flourishing day camp. In 1958, 60 children in 5 age groups, from toddlers to teenagers, participated. And then I wrote, it must be noted here that the activities of the 30s and 40s were not mentioned. A day camp was organized in the early 30s. Language arts, woodcraft, and sewing were among the subjects taught. Campfires, singing, and amateur shows were performed for everyone's pleasure. There were weekly socials at the Grange for the folks. The Clarion, a weekly newspaper, was conceived and published in 1929 by teenagers Jerome Coleman, editor, Raymond Bookbinder, business manager, Jerry Reich, reporter. Local advertisements paid for all expenses of the enterprise. The adults included fishing and bridge among the activities. The impact of World War II was overlooked. My mother took particular exception to the omission of the doings before the 50s. She was very unhappy with the description of her home. The bookbinders have a different slant as to the beginnings. To continue quoting from the annals. The story of the Fourth Lake as a summer colony begins with the arrival of Frank and Lily Ross in 1915. Ross built the cottage which Irving and Doris Schlitt now own. He had been in show business either as actor, makeup artist, or vaudevillian, and was instrumental in bringing theater ticket magnate McBride to the area. Greengate, the property which lies between Fourth Lake Community and the State Park, became the McBride summer home. Many stars of stage and screen, Eddie Cantor among them, were guests at Greengate. Jimmy Walker, New York's major Playboy mayor, was another distinguished visitor. Ross introduced his friend Anton Bookbinder, a teacher of mechanical drawing at Brooklyn Technical High School, to join for the summer vacation. Bookbinder bought the present Wonder House in 1919 and persuaded many of his friends, Riesch, Coleman, Gottlieb, Blickstein, and Weiss, to bring their families here. According to reliable sources, the Bookbinder house had been built out of old wood salvaged from a 40-year-old church. When the Wonders bought the house, they were convinced of its ancient lineage. There was barely a sound wall or beam on which to hang a can opener. Friends pitied the Wonders for having invested in such a poor structure, particularly on a spot that was so isolated and inaccessible. The house belonging to Ellen and Stu Weber was built by Anton Bookbinder in 1956. He had intended it as a camp for his daughter and grandchildren. The house was a 36-foot square, divided into 4 boxes, 2 for sleeping and 2 for other purposes. In time, more rooms were added, trees and shrubs were planted, and in what had been a barren open lot. Then I go on to correct a few errors of fact.
Yes.
The McBrides predated the Rosses. Lily Ross, Billy Clipper's first wife, and Anton Bookbinder's first wife were sisters. My memory differs from Annal's description of the Bookbinder properties. The Bookbinder camp was indeed a patchwork, with additions and renovations built to accommodate family, friends, and guests, but it was a well-loved and cared-for house. Anton was an excellent carpenter craftsman and did much of the work himself. The living room, with its pot-belly stove and banners flying from the rafters, was cozy and warm on the cool August evenings. The bedrooms, 4 in all, were comfortable and functional. The wood of the house smelled of the area, piney and fresh. By the mid-30s, we had an outdoor shower and an indoor toilet. Eventually, we had hot water. We had a large screened-in porch overlooking the lake, which doubled as a dining room and sitting room. One end of the porch was my domain, a curtain providing privacy. The woods across the narrow end of the lake fronting the house was a private magic forest. Isolated? Unacceptable? What utter nonsense. There were 4 houses fronting the little lake. The Martinics, Billy Clippers, the Rosses, and ours. All felt they lived in the perfect location. All believed they lived in an Adirondack personal palace. Also, the description of the little house is not quite accurate. It was built in a meadow, and in those years, Mount Potash could be clearly seen from the property. It was not 36 square feet. It was 20 foot square. The rooms weren't boxes. They were living, dining room, bedroom, kitchen, space for a double-decker in the bedroom, a bathroom, and 2 closets. It was perfect for a young family, not much to clean, easy for toddlers. It was too close to my parents' home, and when the children were old enough to live near the water, we took over the Ross house, which my father had bought from the heirs of Lily Ross as a favor. Yes, we were looked down upon, the newcomers on the other side of 9N. My opinion? Envy.
Well, I think I came up here in 45. I had been overseas in the service for close to 3 years, and Doris and I got married in a hurry. Doris had been more or less brought up here over the years since she was a child. She and her folks had what is now the Jenny Willig, the Willig house. It was then the one became, and we had the first, her folks had it first, then it became the Wonder House, and then it became the Willer House. And when we got married, I came up here, and we lived in what is now the Weber's house. Her folks built that house for us. This house became vacant. Doris's father was among other things, he was asked to sell this house for a relative, I think a cousin. Then Doris's folks decided to buy it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Back in those days, I was working full time, and I came up only on weekends. We rented it for a while. Well, they rented it for a while. I'd never had any title to any of it. But I've been coming up since I met Doris.
Actually, my uncle was one of the pioneers up here, and he came here and lived in, I think, the shack that was knocked down, Stensler House.
Yes.
They rented it, and then he decided that he was going to stay, and he bought the property and built the house that is now Henry Pollett's house. So it was built to his order, and when they first built it, the interior water was not so good for drinking, so they had a well when they first started. And he decided not to come back because he was in a slight accident in the parking lot of one of the supermarkets, and he felt that the driving was no longer for him. And since he had nobody who was going to drive him, at that time it's been about 80. They started coming here when my cousin was about 3. My cousin is my age, so that's and I'm old enough to know better, you know? But that was about 75 years ago, 76 years ago. My parents came up because they came up for several years to visit my uncle, and they stayed for 2 or 3 weeks, and then my father decided that he might want to take the entire summer off. And after, he didn't stay in my uncle's house, he stayed in the Ron and Lys's house, which at that time was much shackier than it is now. And they bought this house because my father thought if he's going to stay for a month, and he didn't like hotels, and they decided to buy it. And it turned out that he never stayed more than 2 weeks anyway, and we started to come up when David was born. That's 56 years ago. David was 3 or 4 months old when we came up here, and we've been coming ever since. At the beginning for a month, for several weeks. You know, it happened to be a very hot summer, the first summer we came up here. And we stayed. Murray went home and we stayed.
One summer, a few years after we bought here, Gladys' parents bought, they were offered the land. This was vacant next to us, all the way down to the creek, for $150.
Yes. So what happened?
And Harry Blickstein, Gladys' uncle, told my mother-in-law, "Oh, don't bother, he'll come down in price."
What?
But when we heard that they offered we wanted $150, I came up that Friday night, ran down to the guy. He owned the Mott's place, and I said, "I'm ready to buy it." He said, "I'm sorry, I sold it for $300 or something." There was a man named Cahan, rather brash, pushy guy, decided he wanted to stay here, and he built that cottage.
Wait, this one that's over here.
And used our water, made a mess of the summer. And anyway, it didn't last long. Yeah, we didn't even know. Sold it to somebody else. Peters, I think.
Oh, that's right. I know.
Mac Peters.
Peters and his wife Evelyn. Right.
Well, Green Gate is my aunt and uncle's home, and my cousins grew up here. And as best I know, Green Gate was built in the 20s for a family called McBride from New York City who had a ticket agency. And they were obviously very wealthy and loved to have parties up here. And the screen porch is a later addition to the house. Originally, it was just open onto the water, and there are stories of parties, drunken parties on the porch, and throwing in lots of old bottles from drinking into the water. And one of my cousins actually, for a number of summers, would put on fins and a mask and dive down. He has a collection of the older bottles that came out from here. Then the McBrides somehow married into a family from Troy called the Stantons, who owned the Stanton Brewery, which was apparently a very big brewery in Troy. And that expanded the family, and they came up quite a bit. And then they lost interest in it, and in the early 50s, the house was purchased, and my aunt and uncle took over ownership and came up with their 4 kids. They chose not to join the community because they lived close enough, and they had their family and friends and activities back home, and so the kids would stay up here a lot during the week, but my aunt went back and forth for social events in Scotia, New York. So they did not join the community. It was my grandparents. My grandfather lived in Scotia, New York also, and immigrated to the States in the early 1900s, and from the Czech Republic, Bohemia. I am pure-blooded Bohemian. And he and his wife started a butcher shop in Scotia, and one day one of their salesmen, a meat salesman or a supply salesman, came in and said that he had a little hunting cabin and he was looking to sell it. And so my grandfather said, well, where is it, and tell me about it. And so they came up and took a look at it and bought it, and that was 1924, as I understand it. My mother was 2 years old, and then she spent all of her summers up here. Her aunt, my grandmother's sister, came over. One of the first relatives my grandparents brought over was my grandmother's sister, and she was unmarried, and so she would spend the summers at the lake with my mother and her siblings and watch them while my grandparents stayed in the store in Scotia, and then they would come up on the weekends. And they loved to do outdoor work. They did a lot of, like a number of the houses around here, people tried to tame nature, and so my grandmother had a number of gardens, and they built stone walls. Yeah, my grandparents' work, yeah. And then they made, when the house originally was, as I said, it was a hunting cabin, and the story was that it was made out of First Prize, which was a big national or East Coast regional butcher company, and so the joke was that the Martinecks, which was a local butcher company, their house was made out of First Prize, the slats from the boxes that they would use to ship the meat. So that was that, and let's see, I don't know what else to say about the house. They did a lot of work to change it over the years. They put a screened-in porch on it and built the Doll House, which is across the street. It's called the Doll House. It's a one-room house, and it was built for my aunt, who was about, I think, 11 or 12 at the time that it was built, and she subsequently died of diphtheria. And so it's always sort of remained in the family as Ruthie's Dollhouse. But my mother played it, and of course my brother and I played in it over the years as well. So.
Very, very distant relatives of my mother owned the property next door to my house. It's commonly known as the Glasser property, more recently Rothenberg. And my parents came up before I was born to a few clam steams, Labor Day weekend gatherings there. These people were from Schenectady, as were several of the houses at this particular area of our Fourth Lake community. And my dad, who had spent many years up at Lake George, up at Hague, was very much enamored by the Adirondacks, and yet liked the fact this was only 50 miles from our home in Cohoes, New York. And so they began to come, and then brought me as a baby to the little house next door to ours, and we spent maybe like just a couple of weeks in the summer because my parents weren't teachers. And my mother, well, she took care of me, but later on went back to work in the business office of a newspaper. And my dad was a musician and an automobile salesman. He played violin, and he was classically trained, and then did a lot of orchestra work, both up at Lake George and in the Albany, Troy area. And my mother always worked for the same newspaper, the Troy Record, and eventually became a manager of one of their satellite offices after I was in school. So we used to come up just about every summer, in addition to going over to Maine and New Hampshire, but they'd always make a circle and come back here and stay 2 weeks in the little cottage, which was very small. I recall the concern about the dark road with the heavy traffic, even in 1946 and previous years, was responsible for the first collection of very, very small amounts of funds from members up and down the road, which is now our community, to purchase some lights for the highway so that those people who walked, which at that time was just about everyone, took a walk after dinner, and the young people, such as myself, would walk rather late into the evenings. And it was very dangerous in the dark. There were no lights, and the town had been approached and said they couldn't put up lights for every little group of cottages that were dotting the Route 9K, which is what 9N was called in those days. And so they wouldn't do anything about it, as they would not do anything about the speed limit. There were no diminished speeds at that time through this little microcosm. And so every few feet or hundreds of feet, people were asked if they would allow the community to put up a light on a pole or a tree and tie it into their electricity and would be reimbursed. And here we are 58 years later, and with some modification of the type of lights, actually that situation is still in existence. There have been more lights in different places added, but basically it's the same issue. Jay's family, they'd go back. That house was one of the early ones built, and beautifully built, because his family were in building business, plastering and whatnot. But his grandfather and beyond, I think even beyond, were here early on with these other people. Jay has kind of a sense of some of that as well.
Your family goes way back, and in fact, it seems to me that your grandfather came here first. Abraham Bashuk?
He was coming to this area for quite, even before the 26. His friend, Mr. Neufeld. My grandfather and Mr. Neufeld used to come up to the baths in Saratoga, the mineral baths. They used to come up every year, get away from their wives and all that, then they'd take a little vacation, and they used to hunt a little bit too. And you know, this area, they were Jewish. They spoke Yiddish. You know, it was a little different for these people. But somehow Saratoga was a great town. A lot of Jewish people came up here for the baths. Neufeld had told my grandfather that he had gone north the previous year to see some of the country, and he says it was like great. You know, that the area was great and all that. We're talking in the early 20s now. The following year they went hunting. And my grandfather had terrible asthma. And when he came into this area, he felt better. He was able to breathe better, everything, he says. And the following year they came up to hunt, and my father was like a teenager, and he went with him. My father had asthma, a touch of asthma. My father was the oldest of his 4 sons. He had 5 daughters also. But and they went to the baths, and then they came north here. Mr. Neufeld wanted to show him some property he just bought, right here, where that house is. My grandfather felt great here. It was around the November time, October, November. And my father lost, the short time that he was here, he lost his asthma. Somehow it just disappeared. But my grandfather, he never lost it, but every time he came into this country, he felt great. So he says, if Georgie could lose the asthma, and I feel so good here, this must be God's country, right? So he bought this piece of land right here.
I first came here as a guest of Nicky Thomas and his family. I lived around the corner from Nicky and his family in Brooklyn, in East Flatbush to be exact, and I was a regular playmate of Nicky's. We played ball on the street, and he lived in a house with his brother, his parents, and his grandparents, and I would very frequently be invited in for the odd soda, glass of milk, or game of ping pong. And his mother, Martha, and I hit it off, and she was a mentor to me. But in any event, at some point they began inviting me to Luzerne, and I would come up here and spend a week or so, or a long weekend. And this must have been, let's see, I graduated from high school in 1948, so this was probably about 1945, 46, something like that. And I would come up here periodically. And then the fateful summer was the summer of 1951, which was when I met Sue up here. As a matter of fact, Martha engineered our meeting.
So she was quite a matchmaker.
She was a matchmaker. Martha was an avid golfer, and she had set up a golf game with two contemporaries, with Dinah Burke and Thelma Todd, and much to my surprise, with a little girl, with a 16-year-old girl named Susan Gurian. And Martha announced to me that I would be her caddy for the morning. I objected, of course, not knowing anything about golf, and I still don't, and hardly knowing what a caddy is, but it didn't sound good to me. But Martha insisted, and that's how Sue and I met.
Now, how did she know Sue? Why was Sue there?
Sue's family had been part of the Luzerne community since 1940, actually, which is when her grandparents and parents began to rent, and they rented numerous houses in the community, and finally bought the house that they did, I think, in about 1945. I'm not really sure. So this was Sue's childhood home from the age of 5, more or less. And the funny anecdote about their buying a house was that when they decided finally that they would cease renting and purchase a house, the two houses that attracted them most were a little house right on the road, and what is now the Mott's house, which is on the water, which we think today is a very desirable area. But Sue's grandmother, thinking in terms of 1940 or 1945, thought, who would want to live near the water? It's so buggy there. And this road at that time was nothing like the 9N we know today. It was a little cow path, and people would have to walk past her door on their way to Pulver's, which is where everybody went in the evening. And so that was more or less the social center, and that was the impetus for their buying a house right on the road rather than on the water. We kidded Grandma about that until the day she died, but in any event, that was it.
So they just made a left randomly. I guess they were looking for a lake, and then there was no parking lot, as you know, the community parking lot there. Only a burnt-out shack of anyway. So they made their way down this road that now is Janine's driveway, and they just somebody came out and said, we're looking for a place, any place available. Said, oh yes, we're trying to sell our place. So they looked around, it was just a shell. That's all they had at that time. Well, these places were just shacks, really. They call them cottages, So they, right on the spot, my parents and grandparents said, well, would you sell it to us, and so on. They came to a price of about $1,500. And my mother gave them a check. My father wrote up the legal stuff, and she paid him within a year, and we owned it. Came here by complete accident. What? That was actually 1941, the summer of 41, and the first summer we spent here was 1942.
My parents, Harold and Dorothy Nagel, first came to Lake Luzerne in 1946, in July. Well, they came because of the Squires. The Squires, I guess my mother worked with them or whatever, but they were the ones who told my parents about this community, which wasn't actually an official community at the time. It was first formed in 1946. and my parents were among the charter members. My house, the original house that was here at the camp, was built by Eddie Sobel, who also built his house next door where John Bennett is. And it was built in order to be a rental property. My parents were here probably about 30 seconds by the time they decided they wanted to buy and stay here. So they were the first owners of the camp other than Eddie Sobel, who built it. However, I do believe that they were not the first current Fourth Lakers who ever rented it, because I'm pretty sure that Nicky Thomas told me that he had rented it once a couple of years before my parents did. The original camp, I'm pretty sure, was built in the 30s. John told me it was built in the 40s, but when my parents came in 46, and I figured out how many years earlier Nicky had been here, and I don't know that he was the first renter, couldn't possibly, so I figured out it must have been in the 30s, probably the late 30s. It was for rent, but then as soon as they saw it and moved in, they said, right, or the arrange. I don't know when the actual finalized portion went through, but that was when they decided immediately. And they rented it from Eddie and then bought it from Eddie. Eddie lived with Corinne, and that was before John moved in. John Bennett moved in about, I think, 3 years after we moved in.
My mother taught at PS 119 in Brooklyn, and her principal's name was Max Shapiro, and he told her about the place he spent the summer, which was Fourth Lake. They owned the house that's currently owned by Barbara Glasser and John. And we came up here in 1947 when Doris Schlitt was pregnant with Anne. Irene wanted to spend time downstate with her, and we rented Irene Bookbinder's house, Doris's mother, yeah. And had a wonderful summer. I was 4 years old, and at the end of the summer, my parents were so sorry to leave that they decided to buy a house. There were two houses for sale, the one in which I live and the Englander house, which of course was very impressive with its acreage and view, but it was about 2 inches from a working sawmill, which made a tremendous racket and ran all day long. So we bought this house. And about 2 minutes after that purchase, the sawmill closed. With a rowboat that weighed about 800 tons, cost $2,700. I don't remember what the Englander house cost. And the titles came after that. Actually, they bought Max Shapiro's house, didn't they? So the woman who built these two houses, her name was Sarah Marks. She was elderly then, and lived in the Rossoff house, where they continued to live for a number of years. I can't remember quite how many, but I was her little friend and her gardening monitor. We used to get manure from the farm and fertilize her plants. Schofield's farm, yeah, and I have a picture of me at 5 and Sarah planting stuff on her rock garden.
That would be lovely for the scrapbook.
It was in the last scrapbook.
Oh, it was?
I think so.
Right.
I think so. It's in New York. Right, and what happened with that, I don't know whether you have any information on this, but, you know, we used the speech and never gave a second thought as to who really owned it. And then one day we found out that it had been owned by a lumber company, I think, and was sold to some developer whose name was Mr. Brunetti, who put billboards all over 9N announcing the opening of Brunetti Park, in which he was going to build condos all over the lake. And you know, we were going to, the lake was offered, the entire lake was, I don't know quite how much land around it, but the entire lake was for sale for $25,000, and we had lots of meetings and lots of discussions. There were 35 families at the time, and my parents were in favor of buying it, but it didn't win. It was voted down.
Do you remember, you were too little to know who voted no?
I'd love to know that. I'd love to know that, but I do not know that.
In telling this...
And then Brunetti bought it. And in about, I don't know, maybe 2 years of torture looking at his billboards, big. God took him away. He went to the big condo park in the sky, and the state took it, which was just a blessing for us. And that's, I'd rather have only our beach, but if you have to pick something a little lesser than that, at least it's a state park. So he died and the state took it. I mean, I don't know the financial details. Maybe the state paid his estate or whatever. But that was the end of the development plans, which was a very lucky thing, followed only by the demise of the last of the Mohicans. I think that Jim Carr was the president. Who else? Maybe Nikki's father. Can't remember. But my father was the president. God only knows how he stood it for 16 whole years, and during the building of the beach, which was very exciting when it turned out to be sand. I remember little isolated bits and pieces. I remember the first community house fell down. The roof caved in. I don't know which builder was responsible for it. And my father was just a darling little person. He was very little, and interestingly felt that part of his role as the president of the community was to be a liaison with the people who live here all year round in First Lake. Kind of, I'm Jewish, I'm from New York, I do not have horns, I have a head just like you. And accomplish that to a small extent. I mean, I say to a small extent because two things have happened to me. A couple of years ago, after years and years of asking Papa in Papa's if I could copy one of his photographs with great care and return it to him, he kept denying that. And finally one year he took it off the wall and gave it to me and said, I want to give you this for your father, who was such a nice man. So I thought, well, we actually did do something. On the other hand, when I went to this meeting in February, the town meeting about the last of the Mohicans, it was clear that it was very much a town gown thing, and that we were still the odd people. But it's only 2006. We'll keep trying. He was first a teacher of economics at Grover Cleveland High School in Queens, and then was assistant principal there. He was a very calm, non-confrontational person who taught me when I was a child that if someone makes you angry or you want to get them to do something, that you must speak very softly so that they have to shut up and listen to you. And that's a lesson I never forgot, and it's really true. You scream, you lose them. That was a good strategy. Yeah, so he was good at that. He could run a meeting, and he was a very likable, totally scrupulously honest person.
I think he's the only person who's honored in the community house, of all of the people who have served as president with a plaque.
Well, he did it for so long.
Yes.
God knows how he stood it, but he did.
Did it kill him?
No.
That we didn't give him a heart attack.
No, it didn't.
No,
Good. No, I don't think he didn't let that get to him. My colorful mother was certainly colorful. How can you condense Lucy? My mother wore a two-piece bathing suit when she was 80. Looked okay in it too. She did not play bridge, she did not play tennis, she did not cook, she did not bake. So she was really her own person. And I think in that age, in order to fit in perfectly, you really did have to do all of those things. She was kind of frightened of some of these women, which was too bad because she was certainly, different talents, but equally laudable talent. She was very, very smart. My mother was very artistic. She was a musician. My mother went to Juilliard. And an interesting conversationalist. She was not a 1950s homemaker. She was not. They fell in love at a city college basketball game, got married shortly thereafter, and seemed to be extremely happy together. They were certainly opposite in personality. My mother was flamboyant, volatile. My father was very calm. I don't think you could have had two Lucys in the same house. Yeah. So, but in terms of what they liked to do, they had a great deal in common. They were both into antiquing and music and literature. I guess opposites attract, and you couldn't have two of her. And it's funny to see that as I get older, I have turned into her. I look conservative because I have little earrings on today, but I do have all sorts of Lucy earrings, which I think are marvelous. And like her, I guess this is a feature of later middle age. After a while, you really don't care what anybody thinks. You like me, fine. You don't, fine. This is how I am. It's sort of the compensation for getting wrinkles and having all your bodily parts lower, right?
I became a chairman of biology in 1957, I think, and I was appointed to Grover Cleveland High School. The man who ran the school, really, was Sam Aronson. At that time, he was an assistant principal. But he really ran the whole organization. He ran the programs. He did everything the way he did here. And he took a liking to me because I was fairly young at that time. And he felt I was the cat's pajamas, in administration, in handling departmental affairs. I used to drive him every day. He was on the way to Grover Cleveland High School. But that meant that every day, practically every day, we had long discourses. Do I have a summer vacation type place, and so on. And finally, it developed into a visit. Now it turns out that not only was I visiting Sam, but I found when I went for a week or 2 weeks that I knew many people. In those days, teachers were kind of fortunate, and they were traveling a lot. They rented their place to me, like the Showstacks and others. The Showstacks would go abroad almost every other year. People said to me, we like you, and we'd like you to, there's a place up here. So I don't know, I never owned a house before. And I looked the place over. And people began to tell me, what are you so concerned about? If you buy it and you don't like it, you sell it. I said, is that so easy to do? I mean, they said, yeah. So I began to make inquiries. And I had talks with Mr. Blickstein, and he said he had made it known all over the place that he had to sell his house. I bought the house, and then we had to do all those changes that you saw, one of which was the double level for the bathroom, which sounded very hoity-toity.
I'm a great reader, and I read everything. So when the teacher union, I guess it was the teachers union newsletter came, I saw this ad put in by, it turned out to be the principal of the school my kids attended, and it listed this house for, I don't know, $3,750, including a boat, including the furniture, including a washing machine. So I called up. We didn't have a car. We lived in a two-family house, and my landlord lent us a car for the weekend. We came up, it was snow, it was a Thanksgiving weekend, and we really couldn't get into the house. It was so snowbound, and we certainly couldn't stay around. It was too cold. We had no place to stay. So we returned home, and we just emptied all the money we had, and we bought the house. I mean, everybody thought we were nuts. We bought a car every year, just in the summer. We couldn't afford a car in the winter. My landlord was he owned a gas station, and he had access to used cars. So at the beginning of every summer, on July 1st, we turned on half-year license plates, took out half-year insurance, and made the trek up here. We came back, put the car, sold it back to him, and that was it. We couldn't afford. I was not working. Norman was a teacher. He made $2,000 a year, very, very little money. So we didn't have it. That's the only thing we could do was pay cash, and that was all the money we owned, from wedding gifts, from whatever. We left ourselves with about $100. We figured he had a steady job. We had insurance, health insurance from HIP had just come into existence. The only thing we weren't covered with was dentist insurance. But we managed, and that's what happened, and it was just so great. Lee wasn't born yet, so he was born in '53, so it must have been, like 51. We also paid the most money of anybody in the community. The prior person was the Squires, and they paid, I think, $1,700 about 8 years before. So people couldn't understand. We didn't know. I mean, it was the kind of thing my father said, well, what'd you pay? We told him. He says, well, what they asked for. I said, you didn't bargain? So I said, we didn't know. We were very young and stupid. We didn't bargain. We could have, because Max Shapiro, the principal, wanted to get rid of it. Of course, it occurred to us later on. He was a principal and making money. His wife was teaching, making money. Where did we come off? But we took a chance, and it was a good chance.
So the house was in good condition?
Yeah. It had a little building behind it. I think it's still there. And it was one room that was usable, that we used for excess company. And then there was a broken floor room that had all the crap, put in there. But my father said, well, you can rent it out. You could do that. So who? I mean, it had no facilities. We certainly couldn't invest. So what we did was we bought from Gottlieb. I remember. He was one of the very, very early people. He had a swing set, I think my father bought it for us for $5. So we had it set up in the back that the kids could swing, and, this is where we went. We just had a mindset. Came July 1st, we got in the car, loaded with playpens and carriages and all kinds of stuff, and no Northway, no Thruway. We just came. But that was the beginning, because that was not just a house, but it meant two of my children met their spouses here. Well, let's see, the first one was Stephanie. Paul's parents and grandparents owned a place here, and he was visiting one summer. I think he was working, he was a junior, I think, at college, and he was working in the Saratoga newspaper, and he came and he was absolutely drop-dead gorgeous, real preppy look. And I called Stephanie, and she was working in New York that summer. And I said, you don't remember him when you were a child, you probably played with him. But I think you ought to come up for the weekend. I never did this before. So she came up for the weekend, and the rest is history. And then Lee met Laura. I think it was the summer that we were building this house. And she too came from parents who had a house up here. We were friendly with them. And it was during a summer experience. And Lee was helping us build this house. And he met her. And again, so there. So we were very fortunate that, and they have a commitment to the community. So now, Beth was the only one who married outside, although she could have married inside. There were quite a few young men who were interested in her, but she chose Bill, and Bill has become part of the family and the community. So we're in the rather enviable position of having our children, our grandchildren, but they have their own places when they go home at night. It's good.
Tell me a little bit more about Paul's parents.
I knew his parents. I didn't know his grandparents, although I know his grandfather was the assistant principal of the junior high school my kids went to, but not at the same time. But Phoebe and Bud, they were not regular people. They weren't here for the whole summer. They were not teachers, but we were friends. Whereas with Laura's parents were here for the whole or major part of the summer, and we moved with them socially, square dance with them and things like that. Paul's father worked for the State Department, and Phoebe was a writer, an employment person, so we didn't have that kind of situation. The other people here were at least 10 years older than we. We were the youngest one. The Kamens were really our good friends. We had met them when we lived in Queens, and one of the political, I think the League of Women Voters or some organization, and they came over to us because we asked a question, and we met. And then it turned out that Saul Kamen's father was my first dentist, Dr. Kaminsky, in Williamsburg, famous Williamsburg, when I was a little girl. But they came, they didn't know a soul. They bought a house for $5,000, and they were able to pay it out like $500 a year for 10 years, and that's what they did. But they came down with 3 kids, I think 3 or 4, I don't know if John was born yet, but we hit it off immediately, so we became friends. And then when we got into the local, activities of square dancing and learned to folk dance, but mostly the organizing of the day camp in the morning. Gladys Rosen, we became friends with her because she's more of our age. Kids were interacting. And the afternoons, we had lunch and we went to the beach. We became friendly with the Squires because one of the boys was our babysitter for quite a few summers, and then the next one was our babysitter. So we became friends with people that we saw in the winter as well. We like community. The community was what attracted us.
When we did arrive that first summer, or end of spring, early summer, the big sign that we were talking about on the way to the lake was Lands of Brunetti, a fellow named, a developer from New Jersey, bought the whole lake. From the Fourth Lake Lumber Company, with the exception of the small footage that is Greengate. And Greengate was on its way out. At one point they were thinking of selling Greengate for about in the 20,000s. And the lake, we were told that the Fourth Lake Lumber Company was sold for just about that amount too, because it was just land, and land and the water. The folks who very concerned. Everyone here was very concerned because if Brunetti was going to develop the land, and he eventually had all kinds of maps laid out of selling plots of land, if it worked out, we would have no access to the lake. And the leaders of the group here, and I say leaders, those who are prominent in terms of making suggestions that others would or would not follow, were to petition the town to condemn a section of the Fourth Lake Lumber Company's land and turn it into a park. And Brunetti said why, because he chose to use the old ice, ask that the old ice road be condemned. And Brunetti was concerned that you were taking the crown jewel of the property away from him. So he then made a counter suggestion that he would sell to the community a 300-foot strip on the opposite side of the lake. And that 300-foot strip is the one the town said that the Fourth Lakers should buy because there was now relief for them. It turns out that that strip was not really a beach, it was a cliff. But fortune smiled upon us all. But I must say that before the smile came, there was a lot of apprehension, because how can you swim from a cliff? When the community got together and there was a sudden tax of about $1,000, give or take, to be paid out over a period of time. And remember, we had spent almost all our money on purchasing the house with $3,750. This purchase made it possible for us to have a claim on the lake. A contractor was brought in, and for about $5,000 built a bridge to get us across to the other side of the lake where now our land was. And that was important because the land would be worthless if it were not done. And for not very much more money, there was a strip that was cleared of trees that led to this cliff. And that
the path,
the current path. And that was cleared by a bulldozer, and I watched this happen in awe. This was a bulldozer with a 20-foot blade that made one pass, knocked the trees down, did all the nice things, and suddenly, after kicking up lots and lots of sand so that you thought you were watching the day after a snowstorm, because everything was covered with this very fine sand. And that led us to the brink of the cliff. The contractor then set up two very huge bulldozers. One remained up at the top, and one slowly worked its way down, knocking pieces of the edge of the cliff down into the lake. So giving us that lovely sand bottom that we now have. And the beach was actually projected into the lake with all this fine sand. The contractor was then given instructions that facing the water, the right-hand side of the lake would be shallow for children to play in, and that it would slowly grade its way down to where the edge of the property, which is the channel leading into the stream that is Stewart Creek. And that eventually ended up at, the drop was 2 feet deep to 8 feet deep, and it still exists. And it's still probably the finest lake beach in the world. And all from this horrible cliff that we're so worried about. And that's the beach. And it's there now. There were all kinds of, later on there were all kinds of discussions like maybe we should put tennis courts up there, which horrified me. More assessments, who was going to pay for it, and I didn't play tennis at the time. Otherwise I would have hocked my shoes and gone along with it. How the sand was distributed into the water, now that I mentioned the contractor. He set up on the beach a pump and a huge generator, and the pump sucked the water out of the lake with power from the generator, gasoline generator, that sprayed water in such fashion that piles of sand were distributed exactly the way you wanted them, which is why we were able to grade it 2 feet deep on one side and 8 feet deep on another, and then dropping off slowly from the edge of the beach back to where the rafts are now. The lovely rafts that we have now are made of aluminum and all those nice things. The original raft that we had, and going back to Bernetti, way before we started on working on the cliff, Bernetti agreed that because he hadn't sold any of his lands, that we could use it, and we would continue doing what had been done before he was here, before he purchased the lake from the Fourth Lake Lumber Company. The Fourth Lake Lumber Company permitted the community people, and that didn't include me because I hadn't bought it here yet, permitted them to build a raft about 20 by 20 and anchor it off what is now the state beach. That raft was in use when I got here, and it was in use until we were ready to move over to our own, what became our own property. And those rafts were held up by steel barrels filled with air and eventually filled with water because they rusted out. Changing the barrel was an interesting game because you could kill yourself getting the barrel under it. And anyway, we had this big one raft, and the day came when we would move it to the new beach. This was after the contractor had prepared the beach for us, and Abe Squire and I were going to row it to the new spot, which is what we did, very, very slowly, and we were caught in a sudden mountain squall, so that I certainly couldn't see where the shores were because my glasses were covered with water and no wipers. Abe didn't do much better than I did. We really didn't know where we were. So we landed on the other side of the lake and waited for the squall to subside, and then pulled it over and set up that one raft on the new beach. That was soon replaced by two smaller rafts that were had a rope set up between them, and the ropes leading from the two rafts that were out in the water to the shore. And that worked out very well, and it was essentially the same shape that we have now. Years later, these wooden rafts were covered with canvas that we got free from the paper mill. These long canvas belts were used for making paper. They were very wide belts, like 20 feet wide, and it seemed endless. And they were useless after a while for making paper. And it was a community kind of thing for them to give us the some of that canvas, which was then nailed on top of the raft. Now that's important because it gets us to the numbers. Years later, the state came by and they were concerned about the safety on these developments in the various lakes throughout the state, and they wanted to know things like how deep was the water underneath the raft. We didn't have the foggiest notion as to how deep it was. You could drop because the rafts would move every once in a while, and we made up a number which was not satisfactory. They wanted to. They weren't just going to write the number down. They wanted to have it marked on the raft. It had to be painted on. Well, it's not easy to paint on canvas, but we could use some very good electrical tape that would stick to anything. And as a consequence, you had to get electrical tape that would stick to anything, even if it got wet. But we had to have numbers that could be spelled out in straight lines. Therefore, when they asked us to mark one raft, we marked one as 14 feet, and we marked the other one as 17 feet. Not because either one was 14 or 17, but you could do that with straight lines in the tape. We could have used 11, but that wasn't deep enough. Started at 14, and nobody measured it. No, they just wanted a number. I mean, this is, the guy was standing on the beach from the state, it was some kind of bureaucrat, give him a number. Community house came a few years later, and there was a big discussion as to where to put the community house, at the edge of the property overlooking the lake, or where it is now, near the bridge which was built. That bridge, incidentally, was built on the upper parking lot, and the upper parking lot was going to be the auxiliary parking lot. Those were the markings. The lower parking lot was to be the parking lot, except it was not as accessible as we thought it would be. So things were a little turned around. But the bridge was built on the upper parking lot, and a huge crane was brought in by the same contractor who did the bridge and the path to the beach and the beach. The community house was eventually built where it is now. It too has a story. The very reputable contractor made a colossal mistake in not tying the walls together, so that the first winter, when the snow came onto the roof, it pressed down at the top of the roof. Top of the roof rested on the walls, and the walls were not held, the two opposing walls were not held together by anything except the top of the roof. And it just plunked down on the floor of the hope-to-be community house, and it lay there all winter long. And the contractor was made good. He came back the next spring, lifted the roof, and stood the house up again. Only, if you look at the walls now, they're tied together by several dozen There's a technical term for it.
Cross beams, is that?
Well, it's like cross beams, but they're ties. They're 2x4 ties that are nailed together into long lengths. And the point is that the harder you bear down on the roof, the greater the stress is on the walls, but the walls can't go anywhere because they're tied together. So it works very well.
Well, we first came to this place as guests of the Teitels, I think, toward the end of the summer of 1960. I think we stayed at 3 or 4 days. We stayed at the Swiss Chalet Hotel down the road. And then we spent some time with the Teitels. We knew the Kamens and the Levys because we had gone on Christmas vacations en masse to boarding houses or places where we paid $5 a day per person and had a wonderful time. So we knew a few people here. In fact, down at the beach, all of a sudden, Pearl spies Barney Delson, who was her gynecologist and obstetrician. And Memorial Day, 1963, we were at a picnic in Long Island with the Teitels and Schwartzes and all of our friends. And I think it was B and Novi said to us, why don't you come up and rent our house for July? Because they had never gone, they were traveling that summer, first time. And they had rented the house in August. And why don't you rent the house in July? So my famous last words to her were, what will I do there for the whole month?
The times that each of us was born. So I was born in 1950, and John, and I was born on Bastille Day, and John, my younger brother, was born on Korean Armistice Day. It was July 1953, and they must have come up that summer when John was an infant to see a house that was in the, I don't know who their first connection was, honestly, that why they came up to see that particular house. Perhaps it had been advertised, but they were looking for a place that they could spend time with at this point, all 4 of the boys were born. So in 1954, I believe, was the first summer that they fully spent here when John was 1 year old. So they had purchased the place in 1953. And the little cabin that is now called the White Cottage was our home for the pretty much the next 15 to 17 years for each summer that we came up here. The boys, the 4 of us had 2 of us had our birthdays here, so it was always a very important spot, and Helen would do all kinds of shenanigans to bring people together at our birthdays, and we had a combined birthday. Helen's birthday was also in July as well, and we would have a grand time with organizing all the young kids in the area to go on hay rides on Schofield's farm. Schofield had an assistant that lived with them. His name was Meredith, and Meredith would hook up the horse and the wagon and throw in a bunch of hay and take us out on hay rides when we were all 5 and 6 years old, and the Teitels, the Levys when they came, the Dermans, the Schlitts, the Rossoffs, the Grants, all together had quite a time. The Sobel kids, it was quite a environment.
Through Dave Burke, my recollection is that he kind of informed them about this place, and then I think they may have known some other people who were here. And my father liked to boast that he saw an ad for the house itself in some kind of communist daily or some sort of left-wing, very left-wing newspaper, and he felt, well, that's for me, that's where I want to go. So that's how they wound up here, and I know we never rented. I think they came up, and I can't believe they would have bought the house sight unseen, but I don't really remember all of the details of how they found that. Well, I know how they found that house, but what transactions took place. But they closed the deal. I do remember that my grandparents helped them pay for it. It was a huge, they didn't have the money really, but they bought it anyway with help from my grandparents, and we all came up here that first summer, little baby and all. 1954, right.
Do you remember the day camp?
Very, very well. I don't remember who the main, Gladys was the director of the day camp. I remember that very distinctly. And I remember my favorite activities were hiking with Norm Teitel. Norm would take us on some wonderful hikes, and that continued over several years. I don't kind of remember what. My father was decided he would be the tennis instructor, so he coached us he gave us tennis lessons. And then we had, by then I think the first year we actually were on the old beach. So I don't know if we had a formal swimming program at that time because we didn't own the beach. And I remember going over to the Teitel's house to get to the beach because they were right there across the street from the trail that you took to get to the beach. And we'd often hang out there first. And I since have been told, to my surprise, that actually the Teitels and their brood were the only other family at that point. Most of the other families had older kids, so that my parents were very relieved when they met the Teitels and found to their delight that they had 3 kids, so who were more or less our ages, and they were thrilled. And of course they met the Rosens, and their 2 kids were David is approximately Michael's age, and Jonathan is around John's age. And then we found the Squires. So Jonathan Squire was my age, and there was another kid named Paul Goodman. The Goodmans were in the house, I believe, the road, Gailey Hill. The second house up was just bought by Hildegard.
Carrington.
Yeah, but that was the Goodman house. There was also a family, the Schwartzes, and they had a son named Seth, who was also around my age.
I've told it many times because I think it's funny how we got here. Saul, being Saul, said, "You must come up to see my place at Lake Luzerne." Just knew him from a lifetime of living together and being a dentist. And he said, "Look, just come up and have dinner with us. That's all we're asking you." And but he pushed and pushed and said, "Please come." I thought it was an awfully long distance to come for dinner. We finally came up, made this long trip just to have dinner with Saul and Helen. I mean, they lived in Queens and we lived in Queens. We could have eaten, but he wanted us to see his place and so on. We made the trip, and they had a place for us to sleep. For Helen, it was nothing to have people burdening her. For me, it would be awful. She was always preparing dinner and housing people and so on. So we slept here, and we had dinner, and we spent the night, and I think they convinced us to stay another night. And we just were taken by the place, and that's how we got here.
Fourth Lake Annals. Each person has his or own image of the community at the fourth lake of Lake Luzerne. In 1976, Martin Rosoff, a librarian at Midwood High School in Brooklyn, and a